Hi, good evening. If you're getting this at the time I planned, I'll say good luck. Actually, I'm recording this on Wednesday night in my home. I'm trying various options. And if it works out, you'll get a final edited product on this coming Saturday night, 8:30, we hope. And eventually when the clock changes to 8 o'clock. That's the plan. So welcome to the Layman series, winter lecture series in Jewish history for 2020 to 2021. Right, that's what we're up to. And as you know, we're now on the second of 15 lectures. The name of the series is Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the Mid-1980s. Tonight is the second lecture. I want to start by thanking the Layman family for being the series sponsor, as they always do. We greatly appreciate it. I want to mention that tonight's sponsor is Michael Glazer, who has a number of family events he's commemorating, as you can see. And I'm happy to, it's in honor of this lecture tonight, and being sponsored in honor of the engagement of his niece, Danielle Dennis, to Josh Weinreb, the high school graduation of his niece, Emily Dennis, the bar mitzvah of his nephew, Ari Meisels, and then perhaps on a sadder note, in memory of his uncle who died not long ago, Harold Glazer, who many of us knew, was a beloved figure in Baltimore. He's a famous Balkari. I took his place when I was a teenager at Dinwitz's show a million years ago. I knew Harold very well. He'll be missed. And also in memory of Norman Friedman. These are all Randallstown people. That would be the father of Kenny and Ira and Morris. And we pay tribute to their memory. Before I begin, I want to thank, as always, my son Yehuda Leib is running the whole operation over here as the Wizard of Oz, running the whole show. Howard Elbaum for putting together the PowerPoint. Yossi Wetstein, who's going to be editing and doing his magic on the final product that you see. And I just want to end by saying you'll be watching this, hopefully, if you are watching, you'll be on my YouTube channel. And they tell me I should tell everybody over and over and over again, hit the subscribe button. So hit the subscribe button. You'll get a magic prize over there, a free trip to Abu Dhabi. As I said before, if everything works out, then Mitzvah Hashem, you'll be seeing this coming Saturday night, right after Shabbos, let's say around 8:30. So again, tonight is the winter series called The Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the mid-1980s, 84 to 88. Tonight is the second lecture. The title is Life After Begin, the chaotic Israeli political scene in the mid-80s. And without any further ado, I begin in this Corona era. Tonight, let's talk about politics in Israel in the mid-80s. Domestic politics. Although Israel's domestic politics is always watched closely by actors in the international political system. You know, the whole world doesn't go to see the Lithuanian elections. And definitely the whole world doesn't go to see the San Marino elections. But the whole press goes always to see the Israeli elections. Now, the State of Israel does not exist and has never existed in a bubble or a vacuum. It has always been part of the international system. That is why last week I tried to lay the background of the decade of the 1980s, the Reagan Cold War years, because everything Israel did and experienced took place within that context. Indeed, a key component of Israel's entire security policy in that decade was emphasizing and re-emphasizing that Israel was an American ally, America's sole reliable ally in the Middle East. And, you know, I always like movies when they have to do with showing the historical times, when they're reflective of the times. And since I was talking about the second Reagan administration, and the culture was very different than now, even though it wasn't that long ago. So I immediately thought of what I would regard as one of the iconic movies of the second Reagan administration, Chuck Norris, Rabbeinu Chuck Norris, who icon figure for American public, a certain chalik in American public, and he did the Delta Force, if you are old enough to remember that, which was therefore it's made up, of course, Americans do the Entebbe, their own version of Entebbe. That's what the movie boiled down to. But the key point is that at a certain point, the bad guys, Arab terrorists, I told you this in the Reagan years, not the Obama years, Arab terrorists hijack American plane, kill American passengers, and the Chuck Norris team, which is American commandos, they're chasing after them, but the terrorists escaped to the Middle East, and now you'll see a scene in which in the movie, they say, what do we do now? And the guy says, the general, what's his name? Napoleon Solo, whatever his name is. He says, the general says, go to Israel. It's America's best friend in the Middle East. If they're showing this in Hollywood, it's a sign of the culture of the times. Take a look at this.
They're going back to Beirut.
You mean it's all over for us?
On the contrary, Colonel. The President wants you to fly to Israel.
Israel?
Israel is America's best friend in the Middle East, and it's only 20 minutes from Beirut. You're going to get anything and everything you want to do it right. The President wants those people home.
So do we, General. So do we.
Hear that? You go to Israel and you're going to get everything you need to rescue the Americans. The message, Israel is America's best friend. Who made that movie? Menachem Golan and all those Israeli Hollywood producers. So I always like these objective movies that show both sides of the Arab-Israeli dispute. Now, Israel hoped that Ronald Reagan would view the relationship between the two countries through this prism. And indeed it worked. All right, let's take a look at the next one. Here we have Reagan with all the three prime ministers at that time. With some he got along better, some he got along worse. And fundamentally, though, Reagan viewed Israel as a Cold War ally. Now, it's not like Israel had a choice. I mean, even if Israel had wanted to, there was no way Israel could be friends with the Russians, with the Soviets. The Russians had put all their eggs in the Arab basket, as you see in the next slide. There's Brezhnev. That's Saddam Hussein on the left. Remember him? And that's Assad on the right. Those guys were, you don't need me to tell you, beyond bloodthirsty, and they wanted to wipe out Israel. And I mean by this, like Hamad, Minarvi Adzokain, Tafanosh and Biyam Echad. They would like to destroy Israel. And that's who Russia is in bed with. So it's not like Israel said, gee, which side am I going to choose in the Cold War? There's no question it's going to be America. And therefore, Israel had no problem playing the Cold War card. The Mossad helped the CIA against the Ruskies and other Reds with gusto. Now, today, you and I live in a different world. Israel lives in a more complex world today in 2020. A world that is both binary and non-binary at the same time. Israel, on the one hand, does have to be, as you see in the next slide, the dependable ally of the U.S. There's Bibi with Donald Trump and with Pompeo, and Israel, as you know, is America's ally. It really is. But as we see in the next slide, Israel also has to get along with America's adversaries. And so Bibi has made it his point to develop a friendship with Putin. He's done this deliberately, gone to Moscow a lot, and even with the Chinese guys, because it's such a world. And basically, he's saying to Trump, I'm married to Trump, but I like to have platonic relationships with other women. Okay? Now, this obviously, as we see in the next slide, causes the usual jealousy in such situations. Not long ago, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, the most extremely pro-Israel Secretary of State in American history, went to Israel to say, don't cheat on us with China. I'm sure you follow this. And so today, relations are much more complex. In the time of the 1980s, Israel didn't have these options. They're on America's side. Now, tonight, we're talking about the 1980s, and Israel was clearly on the American team. Keep this in mind as we proceed to internal Israeli politics. The years 1984 to 88 can be described as the post-Begin era in Israeli political history. Menachem Begin's personality had dominated politics, even though Israel was split 50-50. I mean, Menachem Begin was a polarizing figure in that way, right? Half the people loved him, and half the people hated him. In addition, in terms of politics, the Likud, which had emerged as one of the two big political parties under Begin, was a kind of extension of Begin's personality and charisma. The Sephardim, who voted in masses for the Likud were voting primarily for Begin, not for the political hangers-on of the Likud. He had this popularity with the masses. Remember this scene that I showed you last year with that lady clearly off the street, selling drinks in the Tachem Merkazit? And she's begging. She even tells Paris, take a look. That scene says it all. Begin just had this personal popularity with what we would call the lower classes. Now, it was therefore assumed, both in Israel and elsewhere, that once Menachem Begin fell apart and he collapsed and fell to pieces, which is exactly what happened in 1983, as I showed you last year, the Likud would fall apart and become one of the many episodic political parties in Israel history, forgotten by all but the historians. Here, you take a look, next slide. I don't even think an expert like Michael Glazer can tell who all these parties are from yesteryear. Who is Mifleget Gil? Who is Telem? You understand? I'm not going to take the trouble to take you through all them. But Israel is not America where you basically have two parties. But even in this country, third parties come and go all the time. In Israel, these little parties come and go. And the Likud, one would have thought, after Begin, would be one of these parties that bit the dust. Okay? Now, however, as we know today with the hindsight of 35 years, the Likud did not fall apart. On the contrary, the Likud emerged as Israel's single most powerful party, holding power for most of the past 35 years, as you can see in the next slide. Bibi was their prime minister under Clinton. He was prime minister. He's been prime minister since the first year of Obama, the whole Obama years and the whole Trump years. And back before Bibi, under George Bush Jr., you had Ariel Sharon, who when he was prime minister of Likud. And back in George Bush Sr., you had Shamir, who was Likud. So Likud's held power for a long time in terms of the last 35 years. No one would have predicted this. This emergence of the Likud as the number one party displacing the Labor Party is an interesting phenomenon. In my opinion, a lot of it has to do with two features, A and B, two factors, A and B. Number one, fear of a Palestinian state as a fatal error. Likud is always opposed setting up any kind of Arab state in the West Bank and Gaza and all these places. And they've always argued it would be a fatal mistake. And that's what a lot of people got them to vote for. Number two, the continuing resentment ad hayom hazeh of how the Mapai screwed over all the Sephardim when they came to Israel, the Sal Shabbat years, the Ma'abara years, the radical discrimination against the Sephardim, all the Israeli racism, which is not forgotten by the victims of those racism. Now, regarding the first, which is a question of national security, two opposing opinions have permanently divided the Israeli body politic, the left and the right. The left sees a Palestinian state of some sort properly emasculated as essential to Israel's survival as a Jewish state. The only possible way to get an end, a genuine end, to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean peace. The goal is peace between Israel and all the Arab countries, bar none, the entire Islamic world. I mean, a mamish, a peace. And the left has argued there's no other way except by getting up a Palestinian state. Now, I want you to understand, this point of view is held and has been held for decades by numerous Israeli generals, gourmet bitachon, as they call them, high officials in security apparatus. They had that movie not long ago with the, what's it called, the gatekeepers with the heads of the Mossad and the Shin Bet. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And they all said, oh, we need a Palestinian state. Academics, intellectuals, they've always argued that it would bring peace with everyone, mamish everyone, if you set up a state in the West Bank, an Arab state, as they say, properly demilitarized and so on and so forth. It will bring the desired goal, and you'll get peace with each and every single Arab country out there, including Iran and Syria and who knows what. And number two, it'll save Israel demographically, because it means all those Arabs there won't be part of Israel, and they won't have to be citizens of Israel, and Israel will retain a Jewish majority status. This point of view, obviously, has been shared by the United States of America and by the whole world. Even Trump is in favor of a Palestinian state. Now, he wants a truncated one and a very pro-Israel situation. In other words, it's as good a deal as you'll ever get, bending over towards the Israeli side, Jared Kushner and so forth. But at the end of the day, it involves an Arab state in the West Bank. Okay, let's be clear about that. Now, the right in Israel, the Likud, led by the Likud, has always seen things very differently. First, they say the Arabs, which at that time was led by Arafat, will cheat. Okay? Instead of a permanent peace, you'll have salami tactics. They'll take the West Bank, and then they'll ask for the Galil, which the parts that have an Arab majority, then they'll ask for the Negev, then they'll ask for this, that, and the other. It'll never stop. So it's like cutting away salami. That's number one. And number two, there is no way to get all the Arabs to stop fighting us. I'll give you an example. You'll never get ISIS, Hamas, I don't know who, all these people. They'll never agree that Israel should stay as a Jewish state, even if you set up a completely independent Arab state in the Shtachim, in Yehuda and Shomron, in the West Bank. Not going to happen. And if that's the case, then a Palestinian state of any kind is a cancer, because there'll be a base for the ISIS and the Hezbollah and all these other groups and the Armenians and now the Syrians and the Daesh and you name it, and the Turks, by the way, now to operate against Israel. So it's counterproductive. Look, the right says like this. Look what happened to the Gaza Strip. You had the Hitnat Kut. Sharon pulled out of there to create a unilateral Arab situation. It was taken over by the big guys, and now, as everybody knows, the Gaza Strip has turned into a cancer for Israel, and a cancer that doesn't seem to be curable. So these arguments, go back and forth. Now, the right says we would like it if it was possible to get a peace with the whole Arab world, but it's not going to happen. If it's not going to happen, then follow the consequences. Don't fall for an illusion. And thirdly, by the way, part of the right, especially the religious, is opposed in principle to renouncing any territory of Eretz Yisrael. That's just who they are. The left has always countered by saying, if you don't do this, then we'll have an Arab majority soon. Because there's millions and millions of these Arabs. It's going to become not a two-state solution, but a one-state solution. Then you have to add all those millions of Arabs that are located in the West Bank, for example, to the voting rolls. They'll outvote us, then Israel will be kaput. The right says, well, if you even set up a state like that, the Israeli Arabs themselves have more children than the Jews, and eventually the Israeli Arabs themselves will be a majority in a generation or two. And what do you plan to do then? And the left always said, well, don't be ridiculous. And the right said, why not? At that point, the debate usually breaks down. That's how it works. And so, those who felt like the right have given their votes to the Likud. Take Bibi, for example. It's a major reason he gets elected and reelected. A major reason. Because a big part of the public is afraid of the consequences of setting up an independent Arab state of any sort in the West Bank, period. The second factor in the rise of the Likud, I mentioned before, was the ethnic resentment of the Sfaradim, of the Eidot HaMizrach. Now, we all know, as I said before, and I've talked about it many times, and you know yourself, there was terrible racism against them, terrible discrimination, still is in some ways. The majoritarian Ashkenazi culture that the Eidot HaMizrach came to was a very, waspy kind of situation. And even though what I'm describing really happened and it's worse in the 1950s and the 1960s, and you could say to me, That's 50 years ago, 60 years ago. It turns out that the resentment proved more enduring and more powerful than anyone could have imagined. It may have killed the Labor Party, which is what the resenters have always wanted. You killed my world, so I'm going to kill your party. You don't understand modern politics if you don't understand this anger factor. And I want to destroy you because you messed me over, you did something bad to me before. The desire for revenge and to see the downfall of the people who did me bad is a very, very powerful factor in elections. Okay? In elections. Now, I just pulled a book. Let's go to the next one from Anita Shapiro, the famous Israeli historian from the left. Anita Shapiro. And, she's writing, mamish, a very waspy, condescending kind of fashion. And she describes here, let me see, all these. Here you go. Just listen to this. In the fall of 1982, at the height of the Lebanon war controversy in Israel, the author Amos Oz, he died 2 years ago. Amos Oz was an icon of the Israeli cultural left, a world-famous novelist and writer, and like the personification of Haaretz, you understand? And he's been always a member of the white Israel, has always looked down on the black Israel. Amos Oz embarked on a journey throughout the country during which he encountered both the old and new Israel. So this is wonderful. He's an Ashkenazi guy, but he's always lived, to use Baltimore terminology, he's always lived in Roland Park. He never actually went anywhere else, you see? He was in Savion and Herzliya and all those kind of places. And he never really went into the place in Israel where the masses live. And in 1982, he went to Beit Shemesh, not Ramat Beit Shemesh, but Beit Shemesh, back in 1982 when it was a working class town, a development town where Menachem Begin's stature bordered on sainthood. He is our father, said one of the residents. Amos Oz confronted the pain and insult experienced by people who tried to maintain a traditional culture as it encountered modernity. Now that's Anita Shapiro, the waspy, snooty intellectual, making fun of the Sephardim and their traditionalism. And Amos Oz, therefore, was talking and recording conversations with Amcha in Beit Shemesh, and they said to him, why don't you, notice, because he said, why are you voting for Begin? Why are you supporting the right-wing parties? The left is really the one on your side. We're better educated, and we're going to bring a better economy, and we know for you better than you know for you. And they answered, why don't you ask who taught the kids when they were back in the transit camps, the Mabarot, to make fun of their parents, to laugh at old people, to ridicule their religion and leaders? Why don't you ask who taught the Eidodah Mizrach that money is the most important thing in life? Why don't you ask who invented theft and fraud? Who invented the stock market? Now the kibbutz has its image, but Beit Shemesh has its image, so you're always putting us down. And it's the fault of the reporters and all those mudslingers from the TV and from the professors. So in other words, he got what we say, the Donald Trump voters. And he was like shocked. Now it's funny to me, he's living such an ivory tower that he's writing about this like Clifford Geertz, watching the Tales from a Balinese cockfight, you understand? The Western intellectual deigning to, have muddy his feet for a few minutes among the masses. And then he's wondering, why are all these people resentful? But you see, they didn't forget what was done to them, and they experienced it as a rape. They experienced the Ben Gurion stuff as a rape. And a lot of it was, when we were in the old country, we respected religion, we respected the old folks, the family structure was supreme. That's how in these traditional societies you can have a family of a father, mother, and 10 children, and everybody listens to their parents. So you have a social discipline and don't become juvenile delinquents, etc., etc., etc. And they come to Israel and there was Afgharis. Now, I'm talking therefore about fury against perceived cultural smug condescension, which we know in the modern era is a very potent factor. Here I am a week before the American elections. I have no idea, nor do you, how the elections are going to go. Let's go to the next one. But you know and I know that in the case of Donald Trump, the people who do vote for him not because they think he's a good president. Many of them vote for him not because they think he's a good president. They vote for him in spite of the fact they think he's a bad president. He has many faults. They vote for him anyway. Why? Because they hate the other side. They look at it like the Democrats are smug. Democrats represent the elites. All those people who say, how can you possibly vote the way? It's a turnoff to a certain class of voter, the Archie Bunkers. And that's a large mass of people, okay? Now, this, too, has proven to be a long-term cultural divide in Israeli society. To this day, the left looks down and continues to look down on the Sephardim, the Eidah Mizrach, except for the few members of the Eidah Mizrach who identify with the left. And by the way, I'm sorry to say it, but you know it and I know it, the Haredi world in Israel has picked up this racism. And the Ashkenaz look down on the Sephardim, and that's why you have all these terrible stories that they won't let the girls into school and so forth. But in the mid-1980s, as the left now sees that the Likud and the Sephardim and their entire culture is not fading away, as the left sees that a different Israel is in the process of emerging, where the old culture is being turned upside down, with the kibbutz deprecated, socialist ideals scorned, classic Sabra Ashkenazi secular culture in the process of being replaced by this pagan, chauvinistic, religious, ethnic farrago, the left goes into depression and despair, and even a kind of cultural panic. What is happening to our country? And so you see in the next slide, that book that I mentioned before, where Amos Oz goes to visit the other Israel, in the land of Israel, meaning not Roland Park, not the health club, not the university lecture chamber, but where people actually live. And it's a voice of discovery. The guy's Israeli. He's supposed to be the quintessential Israeli writer. He doesn't know what the heck is going on in his own country. You see? It's like a person would say, I'm going to visit Baltimore. But I'm going to visit Baltimore, neighborhoods I never knew existed, lifestyle I never knew existed before the wire or something like that, you see? And this is what's happening big time in Israel in terms of cultural shift and political spin-offs from those cultural shifts in the mid-1980s, which is therefore a fascinating period in Israeli history. Now, all this was manifested to the world in the Israeli elections of 1984. Let me explain. Normally, the Likud should have been crushed in the 1984 elections. By any normal calculation, it had made a mess of things. The Likud, in 1984, had indeed brought on the mess of the Lebanon war with no end in sight. Let's take a look at the next one. Remember what we talked about? Israel got into there and couldn't get out. Here's the poor soldiers of Sahel. What are they fighting for exactly? Which group are they trying to conquer in Lebanon? It was a mess and a half, and you can't leave. And therefore now you have the guerrilla attacks and all the rest of it, and every week is body bags, and the Israeli public is saying, why? Because the Tzahal had to go and intervene in a gunfight between the Druze militia on the one hand and the Shiite militia on the other hand. What the heck are we doing there all together? And who brought this on? Menachem Begin, it's a fact. Ariel Sharon, it's a fact. The Likud, it's a fact. Second of all, the Likud had certainly made a royal mess, as we see in the next slide, of the Israeli economy. In 1984, the Israeli economy was in dire straits. It had an annual inflation of 400% and had 1,000% inflation, 4 digits. 1,000% inflation in the second half of 84. The election was held in July of 84. A budget deficit of about 17% of the GDP, and a current account deficit driven by massive capital outflows, money going out of Israel, which drove down foreign reserves, and with it reducing the likelihood Israel would ever be able to service its external debt obligations. Not pay the debt, service the debt. I give out. And the Likud did it. It's a fact. I chronicled this sad story the last 2 years. Begin made a royal mess. And since Begin was gone, the Likud, as we see in the next slide, was now led by a man utterly devoid of charisma. You can like Yitzhak Shamir, you cannot like Yitzhak Shamir, he ain't no Begin, okay? It's like the anti-Begin and the non-Begin, I should say, right? And to make matters worse, as we see in the next slide, the Likud itself was divided against itself. It was a snake pit. It's the sharks in the shark tank. Because the three leaders of the factions, on the left is Shamir, and in the middle is David Levy, the head of the Sephardim, and on the right is Ariel Sharon. They hate each other, and they're always backbiting each other and giving reporters scoops off the record to denigrate the other one. You know what I mean. And no, it's a fortress of Lashon Hara, and each of these three represented a different constituency within the Likud, a different shevet. Yitzhak Shamir represented the old guard from the days of the Irgun and the Stern Gang, Yitzhak Shamir was the commander-in-chief of the Stern Gang. Menachem Begin was head of the Irgun, and Shamir was charged of Stern Gang. If you know the difference, the Irgun looked moderate compared to the Stern Gang, okay? Who believed in assassinations and things like that. In other words, Yitzhak Shamir was from the Jabotinsky Kufa. He knew Jabotinsky as a young man, and these things mattered to these guys. You understand? He still will sing the Beitar song and all that shtick, all right, that subculture. David Levy was a Sephardi guy. He could barely read or write. He rose up through the rough and tumble of the political process in Beit Shan, and he represented the masses of the Sephardim, the Moroccans particularly, who gave the votes to Menachem Begin and put Menachem Begin in office. That's a fact. He delivered the votes. He was a loyal Begin guy. Now, these guys and David Levy are patriotic. They're uneducated. They're resentful. They're offended if you say, you can't be prime minister, you have no education. They say, what, Black Lives Matter? Well, you say, I can't do it because of my ethnic? That's discrimination. You guys are terrible. And, both sides were right. But the guy couldn't be prime minister. Ariel Sharon represented the ruthless Sabras, who didn't give a fig for Jabotinsky, but who saw the Likud as an opportunistic tool to jump to the head of the line. Let's go to the next one. There's no way a guy like Sharon, had he stayed in the Labor Party where he was originally, would have ever reached a top position. There were too many people in the way. And Sharon didn't kiss the right feet, let's put it that way. And he wouldn't be prime minister. He was ambitious. And he created, in 1973, he created the Likud Party, by the way. I'll repeat, not Begin. Sharon created the Likud Party. And he said this will be a way for him to become prime minister and rule the country. So that's cool, ruthless Israeli politics, Ben-Gurion style. Now, each of these three people formed their own factions, which happens in political parties, and they denigrate each other in countless off-the-record media interviews, especially when, to the bitter disappointment of the other two, Yitzhak Shamir emerges as the winner in the internal Likud primaries, and he's the number one guy on the list. He will be the prime minister as the head of the party. Yitzhak Shamir is the most unusual person to rise in politics. The guy never went to college. He was the head of the Stern Gang. I mean, that's a genuine terrorist organization. When he got out of the Stern Gang, he got a job working in the Mossad for, what's his name, Isser Harel. When he tried to go in business, he went broke. He is no Chevraman. He is not an extrovert. He is not a schmoozer. He is no charmer like Menachem Begin. When Menachem Begin was to turn the charm on with the Sephardim, with the Frum, oh my goodness, Shamir couldn't give a speech like that to save his life. Yitzhak Shamir was very private. He was a Polish Yid who had the luck to come to Palestine in 1935. He was always bitter about the death of his loved ones in the Holocaust because the neighbors said, we'll hide you, and then the neighbors murdered them, you understand? He was a secular Jew, but he was a chassid of Ari Meisels, the Tzaddik Yerushalayim, Lali's grandfather, who was his shadchan. You go read the Ari Meisels book. This is a terrorist story with a Jewish twist. Back under the British times, when he was moving from apartment to apartment, so how do you maintain the communication? You have runners, get it? So it was a girl who was a runner. She was a Jabotinskyite, and she brought the messages, secret messages from place to place, because you can't trust. First of all, nobody had a phone. Second of all, the British lived within a phone. And the long and the short of it is, if I remember the story correctly, she was always bringing messages back and forth to the commander-in-chief, to Yitzhak Shamir, whatever his underground name was. And since boy meets girl, so they liked each other. And next thing you know, they were involved in some kind of a situation. And then Ari Levin shows up, because he knew the Irgun and the Stern Gang people. And he said, who's this? And he says, my chavera. Ari Levin's like this. We're going to get you chuppah kedusha, make an honest woman out of her. Let's go to the next one. He said, do the right thing. And you can't turn Ari Levin down. And he said, I'll get you a rabbi. We'll do chuppah kedusha. Not under your name, you know what I mean? The British won't find out. But you should be married. And they did get married. They remained married for 60 years. Okay? And so he's unusual secularist. You understand that? And Lali told me he used to come to all the Ari Levin memorial, the yard site things. But Menachem Begin would come to the front and make a speech. And with his oratory. And Shamir would sit in the back. Sit in the back. And I think I remember once He came when Ari Levin had a birthday of some kind, 70th, 80th birthday, and he wanted to bring him a present. And Ari Levin told him, "Are you still married?" Yeah, he said, "That's my present." Yeah. So that's who Yitzhak Shamir was. He was not a frum guy. In Israel, Shabbos is the day off. It's like Sunday. I'm just trying to tell you the wonderful paradoxes. So Shamir would stay at home and just chill, So he would sit in his, what's the right word, in the reclining chair and listen for 2 hours to chazonis. That's what he liked to hear. On a record player, you understand? No, you turn on the record. It's not a frum thing. But he's a Jewish guy. But at the same time, he was involved in all these assassinations, British assassinations in the 1940s, assassinating Arabs. I mean, the guy ran the Mossad station in Morocco. He ran the Mossad station in Paris. They bumped off a lot of people in his time. And therefore, he's a cold-blooded son of a gun, you understand? But on the other hand, it's the, what's the right word? It's the Fauda wars, those kind of wars. And so, Shamir, therefore, was a person who clearly was distrustful of any Arab anything. He had voted against the peace treaty with Sadat. On the other hand, when he was a foreign minister under Begin, he was a loyal foreign minister. His background was Mossad, which implied to the Israelis that he understands the world as it really is, but not charisma. Can he appeal to the Sephardim the way Begin did? No, not a bit of it. Not a bit of it. Now, on the other hand, Shamir did correctly enjoy an image as a genuine patriot. I mean, the guy served time in British jails in Equatorial Africa for Eretz Yisrael. That's a fact. And he escaped. I'm just telling you, he did his sacrifices for the state of Israel, for the Jewish people. He was a man who cared about the country. He wasn't simply another political. He wasn't a guy who was, like Bibi and these other guys, taking bribes in right hand, big cigars, and bank accounts and all the kind of stuff. Shamir didn't have any bank accounts anywhere. And from the point of view of the historian, Shamir governed very logically. He was a better leader in terms of policy than Menachem Begin was, which is something that surprises people. I know it does. This is a very complex and fascinating subject, and maybe now's not the time to go into it, but just 30 seconds. Menachem Begin made one bad, terrible mistake after another in terms of the economy. Not like Begin, but he was domestically a disaster, and I talked about his great lengths last year. And every time he made a decision, the situation got worse. He did it for the best of reasons. He loved the masses and all that, but he made a mess of the Israeli economy. The country was going under. When Shamir came in, he stopped making those bad decisions. You understand? He went by logic. Now, he was deep in a hole, couldn't get out, as we'll see. There was a crisis, but at least it didn't get worse and worse and worse. Now, the economy did get worse because of the momentum that had been built up by the Begin stuff. But Shamir, at least, said like this: what did the economists say? If this is what it is, let's try to do it. Now, let's leave the Likud for a moment. The Labor Party in the elections of 1984 was led by Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres was Mr. Competent. Even if Peres had a reputation as an opportunist and an intriguer, he clearly was a capable guy. I mean, Peres created the Israeli military-industrial complex. Peres did the A-bomb, He did stuff, okay? And this time, in 84, the Labor Party, relatively united, did not engage in its bitter campaign. This time Rabin and Peres did not fight in public. That's what killed him in the 81 election. Rabin said, Peres backstabbed me, Peres a liar, and so on and so forth. This time, they made a deal. Peres would be number one, Rabin would be number two. Rabin will be Minister of Defense. And in the 1980s, that was a full plate. That's plenty for Rabin. That means you'll be the ruler of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. You'll be in charge of the Israeli army. You'll be in charge of the Lebanon war. You'll be in charge of national defense. I mean, that's a full plate. You understand? And therefore, relatively united, the Labor Party did not engage in as bitter a campaign as it had before. Because by this time, they realized that the more they attacked Menachem Begin, even though they wanted to, the more furious the Sephardim became, and the more protective, and that was electorally counterproductive. So they shut up. The hope of the Labor Party was that the Likud would be destroyed at the polls by its demonstrated incompetence. Now, for its part, the Likud, it's a height of chutzpah, ran on a campaign ad that despite the runaway inflation, you never had it so good. One of the reasons the economy was in a mess, because Begin was a big-hearted guy, and he said, let the public have this, and let them have a tax break, and let them buy cheap color TVs and cars and appliances. In other words, let's have a standard of living for the Hamonam. They've been screwed over and over again. They should now have a good thing. Now, you can't do that as a country. You can't just spend money on luxury items if you don't have the money. And Begin did anyway. But if you realize what I just said, the average Joe in the street said like this, I'm living a lot better than I did before. So, it's like the car's going near the cliff, and the person like this, they say, everything's fine. You see? And take a look at this campaign ad 1 second, where you'll see a lady, a young girl saying, you watching me on color TV? Only Begin put in the color TV. The Labor Party would never allow color TV. You got a car, you got a this, it's thanks to the Likud.
יש לנו משהו לומר על הטלוויזיה הצבעונית שבה אתה צופה כרגע. בוודאי לא נטעה אם נניח שרכשת אותה בשבע השנים האחרונות, יחד עם עוד כמה מוצרים המנעימים את חייך.
לא היו כאלה זמנים טובים כמו עכשיו, לכל אחד כסף, לכל אחד טוב. שיבוא לאח, הכל יצלחק.
מה כואב מערך שיש לך עכשיו מכונית פרטית קטנה משלך?
Right? What did the Marach ever do that you should be able to get a car, should get a TV, get a toaster, little things in life that matter to the average little Joe out there. So, this is due to the fact, let's go to the next one, that Yoram Aridor, who had been the finance minister under Begin, basically said like this, we're cutting the tariffs on the TVs, on the air conditioners, on the foreign cars, and therefore they're going to be cheap, the public should buy them. I get that, and on an individual basis is good, but meanwhile, all the money Israel has goes to Japan, goes to Europe, and then guess what? The next day you got nothing. You see? Now, during the election, Yitzhak Shamir said, I realize we got big problems on our hands, and therefore, if we, the Likud, win the election, I shall strive for a national unity government to tackle the big problems. I want to be a national patriot, and so I will strive to set up a government that will be composed of the Likud in first place and the Labor holding, and together will bury the hatchet and concentrate on solving the national problems. Shimon Peres contemptuously did not respond. Shimon Peres expected to win big, and he did not intend to include the Likud in his government. Let the Likud go back into the hole from which it should never have emerged. This gap in rhetoric, moved many voters to look at Shamir as a patriot, not just a politician, while Peres seemed confirmed as a political reptile. The public in Israel, the polls showed, was strongly in favor of a national unity government of both parties. Cut the silly politics and solve the problems. Do something about the Lebanon war. Do something about the inflation. Do something about the social inequities. Do something. Now, as it always happens in every election in the world, including the Israeli elections, certain unforeseen incidents affect voter sentiment. This is always the case. The elections in 84 were in July. In April of 84, there was this very controversial business called the bus number 300 scandal, if anybody remembers it. Let's go to the next one. Does anybody recall this? Armed with knives and explosives, 4 Arab terrorists board and hijack an Israeli bus with 41 passengers. The Israeli bus going from Tel Aviv to Ashkelon. Towards the beginning of the episode, they released a pregnant woman in the bus, but she called the cops. The incident turned into a high-speed chase, and the hijackers redirect the Egged bus, towards the Egyptian border. With the Israeli army behind the speeding bus, they build through roadblocks, eventually having Israeli forces shoot the tires 10 miles north of the border, forcing the bus to a stop, but of course they might kill the passengers. The hijackers hold the passengers hostage, demand the Israeli government free the prisoners, and all that. After negotiations, Israel did an Entebbe raid. Special forces attack on the bus, and basically they killed almost all the terrorists, and one Israeli was killed, just like happened in Entebbe. One Israeli was killed by friendly fire, but the rest were saved. But not all the terrorists were shot in the fight. A couple of them were captured alive. And let's go to the next one. I mean, these pictures were taken by photographers who the Shin Bet said, I wish there were no photographers there. No, this is, what do you call today? The internet, what am I thinking of? that you show everything on the camera. What's the right word? Everything's on Google, so it'll come to me. At that time, he had still photography. This is one of the terrorists. He was found a little bit later with his head bashed in with baseball bats, okay? And the guy next to him also, his head bashed in with iron bars. Now, we're going to say he had an accident. You understand? The Shin Bet was so angry because these terrorists were trying to kill 40 prisoners, hostages. They're so angry that they killed these guys. And the head of the Shin Bet said, waste them. Now, this turned to be a cultural divider. Do you think this is right, or do you think this is wrong? From a legal perspective, this is outrageous. Once you capture somebody, they're part of the law and order system. Even Adolf Hitler. Eichmann got a trial. You arrest these people, you give them a trial, however it works in the Israeli security system, and there's not even a death penalty in Israel. And so if they're convicted for terrorism or something like that, they'll go to some kind of jail or whatever it is, and go on. You can't hit them. You can't, kill them. But here they did. Now, the left, especially the social left, the Sholem Aloni, and people who are legalists, they're not wrong. This is a gross violation of law. The Shin Bet guys should be prosecuted. The head of the Shin Bet should be fired. These guys should go to jail. If you're on the right, they say, wait a minute. These guys are terrorists. Our guys went in and took them out. They're the heroes. And you're going to send the heroes to jail, and these guys will somehow really get off? As a topsy-turvy. And so once again, you had a political divide. Okay? So either this is an outrageous Israeli crime, or you say it's a just desserts. Now, the way this played out the following year is they was going to go to trial, and it was looking bad because the guys did it. They murdered them, if that's what you want to call it. And I'll tell you again, they bashed their heads in with baseball bats and stuff after they'd been captured. The president of Israel gave them all a pardon. All the people pardoned. And the head of the Shin Bet had to resign, Avram Shalom. And that's the way it worked it out. And the head of the Israeli president, which is Chaim Herzog, he said, listen, I know it's a bummer, all the rest of it. We cannot punish these guys. These guys are risking their life for Israel. It's too counterproductive. We cannot have a decline in the morale, a collapse over here. Israel cannot afford defund the Shin Bet. You get it? Defund the Mossad. That's for American crazies. Israel can't even afford those crazies. And so all I'm trying to say is, it's a nice question that people debate. Did that help decide people should vote for the Likud or against the Likud? You understand? If you identified the Labor Party with the left, then this might want you to make the Likud. On the other hand, if you're a principled legalist, a Democrat, and I mean this in the best sense, a person of the law, then everything I just said was outrageous. Now, when the elections come in July of '84, everybody was surprised. There was no crushing Labor victory and no crushing Likud defeat. Let's take a look at the numbers here. In the 81 elections, as you see, it was 48-47 Likud, one apart. In the next election, it was 44-41 Labor. They're close numbers. They're close numbers. And by the way, both parties lost from the previous election. Isn't that interesting? Likud went down from 48 to 41. Labor went down from 47 to 44. Now, technically, the Labor had the most. But, as you know, as we all know, you got to get together 61. So you have to go to the other parties. Now, let's put it this way. To complicate matters, you can't get to 61, which is exactly, by the way, what happened this past year in Israel. You had 3 elections under Bibi, correct? And each time it was mamish like this. It comes up to 52, it comes up to 58. They can never get what they wanted. The two parties between them, 41 and 44, had 85 seats out of 120. The Knesset is 120. That means of 85, you have 35 leftover seats. The other 35 seats went to small parties, small right-wing parties, small left-wing parties, small frum parties, small anti-frum parties, anti-religious parties, like Shula Midaloni's Ratz, which was a self-declared anti-religious party, meaning Not that they want to make people violate the religion, but they want to take away all these privileges that the religion has in Israel. And so, as we see in the next slide, who are you going to do? You want the Agoda, that's the right. He will not stay in the same government with her Shulamit Aloni on the left, and vice versa. You get it? So you can't simply say, okay, I got 44. Let me just collect all the other 35 seats or whatever and put them together, and I got more than 61. The way the cookie crumbles, the way the Israeli parties are with each other, neither will get into bed with the other one. That's how it works. Okay? So Shimon Peres was immensely frustrated. I mean, the guy was a loser. If he put all the left-wing parties together, he only got 59. Oh my goodness. Like Moses, he sees the promised land, can't get there. And people said Peres is a loser. You know, even in best conditions, he can't put together a victory. But if Yitzhak Shamir gathered all the right-wing parties and all the religious parties, he only got 60, which is not enough. It's enough to block someone else. It's not enough. He needs 61. So each guy said, I'm almost there. Rabbi Shalom, why'd you do this to me? Nobody could get 61. Take a look at the next slide and let's crunch the numbers very quickly. The first one is Peres. He got 44 and Shamir 41. But let's very quickly go down the line. Number 3, Tchiyat Somet, that's a right-wing party. Mafdal, the Mizrahi party, that's a right-wing party. Chadash, that's the Communist Party. The Communists are pariahs, okay? Can't count them. Shas, which was a brand new party, that's 4. That's on the right-wing side. Shinoi, that's the left-wing party, is 3. Ratz, that's a left-wing party, is 3. But I just told you before, Shinoi and Ratz were anti-Frum. Then you have Yachad, which is 3 seats under Ezer Weitzman. He could go either way, but he hated the Likud at that point. Then you have some Arab guy, right? Muhammad Miari, can't count him. Then you have Aguda, which is 2, and the Morashah, which is Drukman, is 2. You see where I'm going, right? And the Tommy, which is 1. By the way, what about Meir Kahane? No, neither one wants Meir Kahane. Get it? And so the two big parties got large blocks of votes, and then it was frittered away into little nothings. So what do you do? Now, they didn't want to do what Bibi did this past year and have 3 elections. Okay? This was the 1980s and not the 21st century. So first of all, Shimon Peres simply tries to buy the Frum. It's their money, you know, but it doesn't work. The Likud have created a new era in Frum Israeli history, and the parties like Agud and the others distrust the Labor Party. They think that, you know, you're buying us now, and the minute it suits you, you'll cut our throats. And Shimon Peres says, I wouldn't do that. And they stick with the Likud. It's just interesting. A lot of haggling. Shimon Peres does not want a coalition with the Likud who he hates. But that is what happened. That is what happened. Now, it took a lot of creative lawyering to create a basis for a government containing 2 such parties who were opposed on many fundamental issues. But such creative lawyering, bridging gaps when possible, papering over irreconcilable differences when necessary, was produced. The trickiest part was the Palestinian State question, or the West Bank, give it to Jordan, or whatever you want to call it. And Likud and Labor obviously were headed in opposite directions. You know, the Labor and Shimon Peres really wanted to set up a Arab situation in the West Bank right then and there as soon as possible, because he sees that as a tremendous plus. Shamir is the opposite. The best, and like I said before, it took a lot of creative lawyering to work out a nusach that did like this. We will not make a Palestinian state. On the other hand, we won't make new settlements, you know, like that. The best example of creative lawyering was how they worked out the fundamental question, Mi Yesha Baraish, who will be the prime minister? And the answer is they made a rotation agreement, which is really interesting. And it worked. By that I mean, for the next 2 years, Shimon Peres was the prime minister and Shamir was the foreign minister, and then they switched. Peres quit after 2 years. Notice he listened. He did faithfully observe the coalition agreement, even though he didn't want to, and he resigned, and then Shamir became the prime minister, and Peres became the foreign minister. As you know, this is exactly what Bibi has done now with Gantz. They're simply following the old scenario from 1984. Shamir, as foreign minister, said like this way I can block any move Peres makes secretly to deal with somebody and make a Palestinian state, you see, or an Arab state. I'll be foreign minister. Interestingly, although the two parties together could have formed a government without the small parties, they had 85 altogether. They didn't do so. It went against the spirit of national unity government, which was you want all the parties in there, and that's what they did. I think, as far as I know, this was the last opportunity to defund the Frum. If they would have gone that route at that time, they could have said, we're going to make a government totally of secular parties, half labor and half Likud, and we'll cut the money for the yeshivas and the kolos and all this kind of stuff, unless they join the army or whatever they want to do. And they could have pulled it off, but they did not, which is interesting. With hindsight, we see that these elections were harbingers of disaster for many of the smaller traditional parties. The Mizrahi party, which used to be called the National Religious Party, was on its way to disappear, thanks to Shas, because the Shas party started now and got bigger and bigger. Who were their voters? The people who used to vote for the Mizrahi, right? No, the traditional Sephardi religious voters. But why should they vote for an Ashkenazi elitist party like the Mizrahi with these Ashkenazi guys with the kippahs regal? Rather vote for Vad Yosef. Why not? The Likud, by the way, was on its way to becoming powerfully impacted by the Shas. The Likud can't get no 40 votes now, 40, 45 votes like they used to get. 20 of those votes are going for the Shas. You get it? Again, it's the same Sephardi voters. There's no Menachem Begin running now. You get it? And so it's not, well, the Shas has seen better days. Avad Yosef is gone, but you know what I'm saying. Now, the national unity government, this national unity government in Israel, coincided with Ronald Reagan's second term. The Reagan administration would have to deal with a funny situation regarding the Palestinian question. The prime minister of Israel wanted an Israeli withdrawal and a Jordanian option, that Jordan should take over. The foreign minister totally opposed that. So what's the United States supposed to do? Paris utterly disdained Shamir, whom he regarded as a mediocrity compared to the glamorous figure of Paris. Well, I get it. You know, how can you compare Shimon Peres, who knew all the glitterati everywhere, and moved with the high and mighty everywhere, and had accomplished a heck of a lot in his career, and who was in with everyone that counted. And then you got this guy Shamir listens to Chazonis records on Saturday afternoon, in between plotting assassinations. You get it? I mean, come on. Now, it appeared stormy times were ahead for this national unity government. On the other hand, the problems of the inflation and Lebanon were so huge, a bipartisan solution was actually a great desideratum. No matter how much they disliked each other, Peres and Shamir would find themselves compelled by the national need to work together constructively to deal with Israel's great challenges. Amidst mutual recrimination, the two leaders would indeed work together for 6 years and accomplish a great deal. As we see in the next slide, there's the Yeshiva verse. Let's go to the one after that. National crises can make strange bedfellows, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if it brings everybody together to accomplish something that neither could do on his own. Eventually, their deep differences over the Palestinian issue would come to dominate and tear it apart after 6 years. But for 6 years, they had a run. Now, I think that's enough for now. I've talked enough. The hour is late. And so I wish you a good night, and we will continue this next week. A good tavach.